My name is Tim Nelson. I'm the Chief of Staff at CRSCAD. To my left is Gabriele Tonsil, our Assistant Inspector General for Audits and Inspections. And to my far left, your right, is Mike Bindell, our Subject Matter Expert for Economic and Social Development. CRSCAD is an interesting federal agency. We're a temporary agency created by Congress in 2008. Our mission is somewhat straightforward. Our job is to root out fraud, waste, and abuse and promote the efficiency and effectiveness of programs in Afghanistan that are funded by the US government. Now it's kind of a dense government kind of phrasing there. So I think I want to break it down and kind of explain a little bit more simply what we're trying to do. CRSCAD is an oversight body. We look at the things that aren't working right. That's specifically in our mandate. If you look at our enacting legislation, it says that CRSCAD should find the things that aren't working well. And the idea is that we're an independent body. We're not implementing these projects. We come in with a fresh set of eyes, see what isn't working right, peel back the things that sometimes hide what's really happening, and then point them out to policymakers so they focus on the challenges that are really in front of them that they may not have seen before. Now, we do this work primarily through our audits and inspections work. That is really kind of like a management consultant function. What we do is we go in and we look at programs and projects and say, all right, these were the goals. This is what the US government tried to do in this particular project. And then we say, well, did it do it? And if it didn't, why not? And then make recommendations to try to improve it. Now, frequently when you deal with things in Afghanistan, it's complicated. It's a war zone, obviously. So sometimes the things that we find aren't just programs that are struggling. We actually find criminality, things that are very, very bad that need to be prosecuted. So when Congress created CRSCAD, they also gave us law enforcement powers. So inside our agency, we have individuals with badges, with guns, with handcuffs, who will go out and try to find the people who actually stole from the US government and then bring them to court and hold them accountable. Now, our work is of interest to Congress and policymakers. To help make it a little bit easy sometimes, we were directed to put out a quarterly report to Congress that summarizes our work every 3 months about what we've been doing. But also, I think it's really interesting for many of you working in the policy area, we also try to summarize what's happening in Afghanistan. We have a 250-page book we put out every quarter that summarizes the security forces in Afghanistan, how they're doing, an assessment of the economy, schools, healthcare, information that really kind of creates a very honest picture of what's going on in Afghanistan, and it's incredibly useful. And I encourage all of you who care deeply about Afghanistan to take a look at our report and use it. In addition to the things I've mentioned before, CRSCAD is now also launching a lessons learned program as well. We're trying to take these individual audits, these individual criminal cases, and the information we present in our quarterly report and try to put it in context. You know, the United States government's been involved in Afghanistan for 14 years. It's a massive investment on the United States' part to try to improve Afghanistan. CRSCAD is trying to say, well, what did it all mean? Let's take stock and see if not only we can take stock and improve Afghanistan, but also speak to those other conflicts. Our return to Iraq, Syria, Lebanon. I mean, pick a country. There's many countries in the world that have had challenging environments and will probably have problems again. So we hope to try to bring it all into perspective. Now, the reconstruction in Afghanistan is just massive from the US government's perspective. It's about $110 billion over the last 13, 14 years. It's the largest investment in any one country ever by the United States government. And this doesn't even include the war fighting. If you include the war fighting, you're looking at roughly $1 trillion investment. The reconstruction is absolutely critical because it's the insurance policy on that $1 trillion investment. The reconstruction is anything that's designed to improve the capacity of the Afghan government to succeed. And that ranges from building their security forces, their army and police, the things you would normally think of a word like reconstruction, schools, hospital, and the capacity of the Afghan government to achieve what it needs to do to hold this government together. CRSCAD is deeply worried about the reconstruction because we want to make sure we get it right. Just like everyone who cares about Afghanistan, we want to see it succeed. And so we've been looking for the things that are problematic because, again, what we want to do is make sure the policymakers see clearly the challenges that they may not see, to make sure we get those right, to make sure that the reconstruction succeeds, and that investment, that $1 trillion US investment, the 2,200 lost soldiers and Marines, and the countless Afghans who have lost their lives, that their struggle will be for something. Now, unquestionably, there have been gains and successes in Afghanistan since 2001. Although CRSCAD frequently focuses on the things that are problematic, you cannot look at Afghanistan and not say that there's been significant improvements. Living under the Taliban era is not something I personally would want to do. But just think about the massive gains in education. Young women, young girls who can go to school who never had the hope of that before. Massive gains in telecommunications, improvement in healthcare. Clearly successes have been made. However, CRSCAD says that there are challenges, there are risks, and we have to mitigate these risks to make sure that the reconstruction doesn't stumble at this point, so these hard-fought gains don't slip away from us. Now, it's hard for me to sit down and think about a $110 billion investment and kind of break it down into 7 bullet points. But for us at CRSCAD, this list right here are the 7 things that we're trying to focus on, the things that we feel that if we, the U.S. government, don't get right, there's an increased chance that it will slip away from us. First and foremost of these is security. The bulk of actually the U.S. assistance in the reconstruction area has actually been in the security sector, and for good reason. If you don't have basic security, everything else is just going to be impossible to do. No one's going to go to school if there's a conflict right in front of their school. No one's going to invest in a country if they're worried about guns and bullets, right? The security sector, $70 billion invested to date. That needs to go right. And we have a lot of work in CRSCAD that says there's problems there, challenges in making sure those security forces actually are achieving the goals and have the capability and capacity to do the things that they need to do. Next on this list is corruption. Not a surprise, we're an oversight agency, we care about corruption. But corruption is particularly important because if you think about Afghanistan, every developing country, and even our own country, has problems with corruption. But yet, about 5 or 6 years ago, with the massive influx of dollars, corruption started to spin out of control in Afghanistan. And corruption is problematic not just because, maybe instead of spending 100% of your money on an assistance project, you're spending 80 or 90 because the corruption's eating away at it. But it undermines the local population's belief in their government. And that's critical for us to succeed. Actually, General Allen recently said, former General Allen, commander of military forces in Afghanistan, said that corruption might be the existential threat to Afghanistan, the one that we ignore to our peril. The next on this list is sustainability, kind of I think the linchpin of our conversation for you all today. Sustainability is really a 3-part question for us. Do the Afghans have the financial resources, the technical capability, and finally the political will to sustain the things that we provided to them through our assistance over time? And CRSCAD argues that there's some big issues here that we really have to worry about. I mean, at the most simple level, Afghanistan raises about $2 billion in revenue at this point. The Afghan government themselves has said it might cost 8 to 10 to sustain the schools, the bridges, the security forces that we've built for them. If we as the U.S. government don't find a way to help them overcome that gap over the next 5, 10 years or so, much of what we invested will quickly crumble before us, and that would be a pretty disappointing result. The next one on our list I think is really a good one to think about. It's narcotics. Everyone knows that Afghanistan has a narcotics problem. 90% of the world's opiate comes from Afghanistan. It's not a good success story, despite the probably about $8 billion the U.S. has invested alone, let alone what our international partners have invested. But narcotics isn't just simply a problem of drugs being bad. Narcotics is a poison on everything that's happening in Afghanistan right now. If you think about it, a significant portion of the insurgency revenue comes from the drug trade. In addition, it feeds the corruption problem, which then weakens the central government. We argue that it's time for the U.S. government to take a fresh look and be pragmatic about what you can and can't accomplish, but we need to do better in a more sustained fashion on the narcotics end. Well, that's 3 elements here that we focus on. A bit more technical, a bit more in the weeds. We have some concerns about how to make sure that the assistance provided to the Afghan government through on-budget support, or sometimes called government-to-government assistance, either directly or indirectly through international trust funds, is properly managed. The technical capabilities of the Afghan ministries is quite low at this point. Obviously, gains have been made since 2001, but they still struggle with kind of basic internal controls, ability to monitor projects, particularly in violent areas. I was talking to the Minister of Education and Health recently, and they both said that they just can't get out into the conflict zone areas to see their own investments. So making sure that goes well is important. Basic contract management, it's difficult to do contracting in the United States anywhere. If any of you have dealt with a U.S. government contract, they're clunky instruments. Particularly hard to do it in a conflict zone where you can't get out necessarily always and see your project. And finally, CRSCAD has been kind of concerned about strategy and planning. There's grand visions that are sometimes made, But as you work your way down from the grand vision, into a country plan, into an individual project, sometimes there's a disconnect between that young Foreign Service officer or that captain in the field struggling to try to make a project work, and sometimes that grand vision for someone a little bit further away. That disconnect makes it hard to really assess what gains we have and what our baseline truly is in what we do. So that's just kind of a snapshot overview, I think, of what my agency does and kind of where our big concerns are, the things that we're trying to focus our energy on to help policymakers make sure that we get this right. What I'd like to do is turn it over to my colleagues here who can get a little bit more into the weeds and some of the things we've seen and give some concrete examples of these challenges that we want the U.S. government to focus on to make sure, again, we can sustain these hard-won gains.
Good morning, everybody. What I'd like to do is talk a little bit about CRSCAD's work and kind of what we've seen as issues with sustainability through our audits, inspections, and then also through our special project work. As Tim mentioned, there are three kind of main elements of sustainability. What I'm going to focus right now on is that second, mostly on that second piece, which is the technical capability of the Afghan government to sustain the different areas and projects going forward. A lot of our reviews since CRSCAD has been created have focused in some way on sustainment, particularly since 2012 when it was announced the transition to the Afghan government taking responsibility for security of the country. That plan was laid out and progress is being made towards that goal. While we recognize, as Tim said, that there have been a lot of successes and gains made throughout this reconstruction effort since 2001, we are very concerned with some challenges that we see the Afghan government and the U.S. government facing as we proceed forward for the next few years. The three areas that I'm going to focus on, there's going to be some overlap in between them, but our sustainment of the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces, or the ANDSF, which consists of the Army and the police, operation and maintenance of infrastructure, non-security infrastructure, so things like schools, electrical facilities, clinics, that sort of thing, and then also the technical capacity of various ministries to actually maintain these programs or implement development programs in the future. As Tim mentioned, security is paramount. As such, a lot of our work has focused on the security sector specifically. Most of the reconstruction money that the U.S. has obligated towards the reconstruction effort have gone towards building, equipping, and sustaining the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces. Right now, the ANDSF is authorized $352,000, $195,000 in the Army, and $157,000 in the police, and plans to maintain that through at least 2017 with initial intentions to decrease that, assuming the security conditions permit. However, as of now and since 2001, the international community has been providing the bulk of the assistance to keep that force going. So just from a pure monetary standpoint, we do have concerns about the Afghan government's ability to fund this force going forward. And of course, without, as we've already discussed, without security, development and economic improvements are really not going to, it's going to be very difficult to not only increase or maintain what's been done, but to also increase that further. As we've looked at the ANDSF through our work, we kind of see a couple of key issues that raise concerns about sustaining this force. One is with respect to the infrastructure. We found in our prior work that not only do the ANSF have too much infrastructure, the United States and other coalition partners have built just more than what the ANSF is able to handle. But there are also difficulties that the security forces face in maintaining this infrastructure. Again, one key element of the security force is, of course, we want a force that can go out and fight, combat extremism and insurgency, but unless they can sustain their own facilities where they have to sleep and maintain their equipment, it's going to be very difficult for them to meet that security fighting challenge. So we've seen that they have very much difficulties with maintaining the infrastructure, recruiting the necessary people with the skills to maintain critical facilities. So those would be your power plants, your wastewater treatment plants, and other types of facilities. In addition, we've also seen that the ANDSF have difficulty maintaining equipment and getting supplies needed to service their people. We've seen in our past work that there is not enough technical capacity to maintain vehicles, to get the parts for those vehicles. These would be your high armored pickup trucks and those sorts of things, as well as more sophisticated equipment like aircraft. The force at the moment just does not have enough organic capability to maintain those critical pieces of equipment. There's also difficulty that we've seen from the ANDSF in getting supplies through the supply chain to the units that actually need them. And we've taken steps as the U.S. government and others to try to help fix these problems. So we are still seeing difficulties getting spare parts and fuel, things needed to run critical equipment and facilities. With respect to operation and maintenance of non-security infrastructure, these would be things, as I mentioned before, power generation facilities, schools, health clinics. We did a report in 2013 that found that for the national power utility, which is otherwise known as DABS for short, has had difficulty generating enough revenue to be able to be self-sufficient. And this is a critical ministry that it's in charge of generating power and providing power to all of Afghanistan. We've also seen that, again, the United States has done a lot of large-scale projects to help rehabilitate some of its electrical infrastructure, but the Afghan government at this point may not have the money to cover the fuel and provide operation and maintenance on those facilities. We've also reported from on switching over to schools, USAID funded two hospitals in particular that one of our audits focused on that were built to be much larger than the Afghan government needed, and the operation and maintenance costs on those are 5 times what the Afghan government was paying on the current facilities. So not only may the facilities be in excess of what the Afghan government needs, the Afghan government may not be able to maintain those specific facilities. In addition, we reported earlier this year on an industrial park in Balkh province that, again, constructed by USAID, turned over to the Afghan government, that since it was turned over to the Afghan government has experienced very low occupancy, and that turnover happened in 2008. And the main reason for this is because the Afghan agency in charge of maintaining this facility and trying to attract Afghan businesses to work in it could not afford the fuel to ensure that there was electricity running at the site. So again, we found, these are just a couple examples of some of the concerns that we have and issues we found with operation maintenance of non-security facilities. And then the last point, getting at the technical capacity of the ministries themselves, and this is particularly important given the ongoing shift to direct assistance, so the US government and other governments providing money directly to the Afghan government to implement programs itself. We found that overall, the ministries are not able to fully manage and account for direct assistance funds, and these are funds needed to support the security forces, again, paying salaries, purchasing equipment, some basic things that are needed, as well as implementing development programs for non-security ministries. So that would be ministries like the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Public Health. For example, with respect to the security ministries, we found in a December 2013 review that the Combined Security Transition Command, or CSTICA, which is responsible for, on the US side, for working with the ministries to develop capacity, managing US direct assistance funds to the security sector, found a lot of problems with the MOD, the Ministry of Defense, the Ministry of Interior, and the Ministry of Finance's ability to count for direct assistance funds. And this included things such as weak accounting practices and effective training on accounting systems, as well as systematic gaps in literacy. And literacy is actually an issue that we've seen across the board with the Afghan National Security Forces. And again, going back to what I mentioned before, doing some of the maintenance on more complex systems such as aircraft, power systems, and wastewater treatment systems requires a certain level of literacy and being able to understand and read manuals and that sort of thing. So literacy is a cross-cutting issue that affects a wide range of sustainment of the Afghan National Security Forces. Outside of those ministries, in January 2014, we reported on USAID's comprehensive assessments of several Afghan ministries. Initial assessments were done of 16 ministries and essentially found that none were able to manage and account for funds unless those ministries implemented a variety of risk mitigation and recommendations to improve their ability to manage funds, which would be including improving procurement systems, improving human resources management, improving internal oversight of those funds. USAID then conducted a second set of reviews of 7 ministries that had active or planned direct assistance programs, and again it concluded that none of the ministries would be able to handle direct assistance funds without a risk mitigation strategy in place. And at this point, both USAID and CRSCAD have been working with the various ministries to try to improve their capacity, but we do still have concerns, again, with their ability to manage these funds going forward.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for hosting. Thank you, UMass Boston and the McCormick School. This is a very important conversation to have, and it can't be stated often enough. Now, to echo what Tim started out saying, there's no doubt that there have been real successes in Afghanistan, especially from the time of Taliban governance. And the real question, though, is what is that a result of? Is it a result of improved security, massive in-country spending, budget subsidies, or is it a result of successful development and successful implementation of aid? And that's a real question. So while we're not challenging that successes were made, we really do need to peel the layers back and figure out what level of success are we achieving, is Afghanistan achieving? And putting rhetoric aside, we really need to have this open and honest conversation on sustainability, what sustainability means. And in order to do that, and we really need to know Afghanistan's real situation, and we need to need to know Afghanistan's needs for going forward. Now, many of the estimates on metrics that you will read are often best case scenarios, and that are often accepted without any outside validation. And as Dean Cash said earlier, we need to really have sound methodologies. And just 2 quick examples of that is education and health. Now, clearly there are more children in school these days. We don't know exactly how many. There's a dispute on how many children are in school. Clearly there are more females in school learning, but we really don't know how many schools are open. We don't know how many students are attending at any given time. We don't know if they have textbooks. We don't know if their level of literacy, because no widespread assessments have been done, especially in early grade reading. And in healthcare, just for instance, it was claimed that there's a 20-year increase in life expectancy that's been widely touted by the U.S. administration and others. And clearly there has been an increase in life expectancy. 20 years seems to be an enormous jump. There are discrepancies with other metrics, other organizations on the base from which that 20 years was started. So these are just some of the things that we need to take a closer look at, and not just take it for granted that the numbers that are presented to us are true. So on the first slide, we're talking about real GDP growth. So the last few years, there have been 2% growth in the economy compared to 10.5% for the 8 preceding years. Now, that 10.5% is largely due to artificially inflated demand related to the foreign presence. Now that that foreign presence is reduced, investments are being reduced, we're seeing the economy grow at probably a more realistic rate, around 2%. The World Bank and others are projecting a 2 to 2.5% increase in economic growth this year, but they caveat it as highly fluid. And it depends on many variables that are outside of people's control, the stability of the political, security, and business environments. And let's talk about that for just a moment. So these projections and models are based on assumptions under different scenarios that change, that are sensitive to change. So developments that were expected change. Donor aid flows change. Improvements in the investment climates. Improvement in security, various degrees of mineral and extractives expansion, agriculture sector growth. These are all very volatile and are subject to change and cannot be relied upon. And so when you look at these models, you have to say what is realistic and what has borne out over the last several years. Agriculture and the services sectors have been driving the economy and will likely drive the economy in the future. But again, agriculture is dependent on good weather. Years of good weather, agricultural production improves, GDP growth goes up. Bad rains, drought, flooding, we'll see a different story. And that is outside the control of what the international community and their efforts. USAID has spent close to $2 billion in agriculture, but again, what has been driving agricultural growth? As Tim said, opium is a huge problem in Afghanistan, and opium production is excluded from official GDP figures, but it features prominently in the economy. Farm gate price of the opium economy is estimated at around 4% of GDP, but the higher priced opium exports could easily double that, if not more. The demand for industry and services, also driven by the international presence, has taken a hit over the last few years. There's business and consumer uncertainty with the security situation. Again, less demand by fewer international forces. Winding down of projects towards the end of 2014, and that trend is supposed to continue into 2015. Afghanistan has substantial mining wealth potential, and the World Bank and others, the United States, the Afghan government, believe that the development of Afghanistan's natural resources can underpin future economic growth and wean them off donor assistance in the future. I mean, there is some real potential there. But that potential is decades away from being realized. They have some of the richest sources of precious and semi-precious stones, massive quantities of copper, iron ore, oil, natural gas. But many of these mines are in insecure areas and littered with mines, unexploded ordnance. There's corruption. There's an uneducated workforce, lack of labor safety standards, crude extraction methods. All of these are inhibiting factors on developing mining sector. And public and private sector investments are needed. Another huge problem with the mining sector is that there's very little transportation infrastructure surrounding these major mines. And it's not like you can truck copper or iron ore on the roads out of the country. You need rail infrastructure that doesn't exist in Afghanistan. And many of these massive projects were awarded with the understanding that the winning companies would go and build not only transportation infrastructure, but also energy projects associated, as well as building community development in the surrounding areas for the workers. None of that has borne out yet. So far, mining's contributed very slightly to GDP. Just to give you a slight example, last year, the Afghan government only expected about $26 million from extractives revenue. That's a fraction of their potential, but actually receipts were less than a third of that. This year, they've increased their expectation of mineral revenue to $35 million, but there's no developments so far to suggest that that's going to be realized. In fact, so far, they're about 70% lower revenue collection over the same period last year in the first 4 months of this fiscal year, 1394. There are also a lot of illegal mining sites. The government will officially declare about 1,400 mining sites to be illegal. Some estimates put it at around 2,000 or 3,000 illegal mining sites. And not only does that deny the Afghan government significant revenues, but it also funds the Taliban and other insurgent forces which use that money. They take over these mines and use their leverage through extortion. So revenues have not been realized. The fiscal gap is large and growing, and donor contributions generally make up the difference. So if you look at the next slide, you can see the difference between Afghan government's budget, their revenue collection versus their expenditures. So domestic revenues include tax and non-tax revenues and customs duties, the red bar, and operating budget expenditures, the light blue bar, is what the Afghan government generally pays for. The dark blue bar, the development budget, is mostly paid for by donors. So no one's even asking the government really to take over that development budget. In fact, if the donor community would lower the development budget, it's an open question on how much the Afghan government would spend or take over in the event that no one else paid for it. So that's something that we can't control for, but it's something just to keep an eye on. Last year, FY 1393, domestic revenues missed government targets by about 35%, $600 million. And that was about 10% lower than FY 1392. And domestic revenues paid for only 33% of Afghanistan's total budget last year. Meanwhile, expenditures were increasing, mostly for security. Expenditures increased about 9.2% compared to FY 1392. So Afghanistan finished last year with a $537 million shortfall, which it asked the international community to help pay for. In response, the United States gave about $100 million, and the rest of the international community gave approximately $50 million, leaving about $387 million, close to $400 million budget shortfall. And that's how they began this latest fiscal year, which started at the end of December. So they began 1394 with weak cash reserves, significant arrears, and stalled revenue collection reforms in the government. And the World Bank has cautioned, because of this, that the Afghan government can face similar budget shortfalls this year, similar to last year's. The current budget projects revenues to be about 30% more than last year, and the World Bank found that to be ambitious, and it certainly is, given the budget numbers, the fiscal monthly bulletins that have been coming out. At the end of last year, Afghanistan they made some progress. They took austerity measures. They reduced overtime. They reduced salary increases, bonuses, and other civil service benefits. And they stopped funding and embarking on new development projects that they couldn't afford. But the cost of security and mandatory social benefits, the non-discretionary portion of their budget, increased. So in the first 4 months of this year, we've seen domestic revenue collection increase slightly over the same period of last year, but they still missed government targets by about 6%. And so far in the first 4 months of the fiscal year, their revenues have covered less than half of their total budget expenditures. So the areas where donors are the driving force for sustainability. One of the points I'm going to talk about is not on the slide. I'm just going to start out with trade. So Afghanistan has very few products that it exports. It's mainly an importer. Their export products are agricultural related, dried fruit and fresh fruits, as well as carpets, non-ag related. And they are, again, highly dependent on a few commodities and have very few trading partners, which makes them highly vulnerable to any kind of trade shocks. Now, the IMF estimates that Afghanistan imports about $10.6 billion a year. The international community covers more than $8 billion of that. So, although Afghanistan largely, routinely incurs a large trade deficit, donor aid helps Afghanistan maintain a current account balance of 5.7% of GDP, which is a good thing. But without it, peel that away, and there would be about a 36% of GDP deficit, which would put Afghanistan in a similar league of Mozambique and Liberia. Security. The Defense Department, US DoD, said that under a best case scenario, just gaming it out there, if Afghanistan had high GDP growth of the 10% range, 8, 9, 10% range that it had when it was artificially inflated, and all that money went to pay for the security sector, it would only be able to pay for about 20% of security costs. And they cautioned that Afghanistan has to reduce their security costs. They will not be able to maintain current force levels at the current rate. And DoD said that security-related resources are wasted due to lack of control mechanisms in their business processes, massive corruption, lack of long-term partnerships with the private sector. Power. USAID has spent more than $2.7 billion to build generators, substations, transmission lines, and other technical assistance in the sector. DoD has spent close to $2 billion doing the same thing. And these projects are massive undertakings in very challenging environments, and they are years away from fruition and years behind schedule. People talk about Kajaki Dam in the news and installing a third turbine, again, years behind schedule, blood and treasure lost, bringing the turbine to Kajaki. So there are security challenges, it's in a rough neighborhood, there are contractor challenges, and there are management challenges with the Afghan government, which is maintaining the contract and overseeing the contract right now to install the third turbine. Many people also question what kind of electricity can be generated from that turbine. And once that turbine goes online, the other two will probably go offline for repairs and maintenance. So in the meantime, while Kajaki is being developed, while that third turbine is waiting to be installed, the Defense Department has been spending money fueling diesel generators in Kandahar City through the Kandahar Bridging Solution. So far, they've spent about $140 million on these expensive, unsustainable diesel generators. They have wanted to cut off those fuel subsidies in years past, but have been convinced because there are no viable alternatives to these diesel generators at this point. However, in September of this year, DoD said they're cutting fuel subsidies with no chance of any kind of extension. And when CRSCAD has pressed US government agencies what the alternative will be come September, no one really knows. There is no good answer, and right now we are looking at the lights going out in Kandahar City starting September. Transportation, CRSCAD just finished an audit on civil aviation and managing airspace traffic control. And that contract that the US was paying for was supposed to end at the end of 2014, but realizing that the government, the Afghan government, couldn't take over their airspace management, the US government extended their contract through September 2015, and I guess we'll see what winds up happening, but the Afghan government has taken over, has awarded a contract to an air traffic control team, and we'll see what happens. Roads, The U.S. has spent over $2 billion building and maintaining roads, yet the World Bank says 85% of the road infrastructure is crumbling. Afghanistan has a projected $100 million deficit in their O&M expenditures, so they're in a shortfall of about $100 million. So it's another example of billions of dollars of investments that are not being sustained and cannot be maintained at this point. Lastly, I'll talk about education and the improvements that have been made in education. Again, for the sake of repeating myself from my earlier statements, there have been some real gains in education, but the extent of those gains remain in dispute. Education, the Ministry of Education accounts for about 43% of non-security spending, mostly for teacher salaries, and that comes out of the Afghanistan Reconstruction Trust Fund, which is administered by the World Bank. And teachers represent almost half of all Afghan non-uniform civil servants. So this is a tremendous expense outside of security. The Afghan Reconstruction Trust Fund annual report said that there are insufficient number of schools to meet the growing demand of students. Many facilities lacked boundary walls and water wells, which are key components for a safe and functioning learning environment. The Minister of Education was called before Parliament this last quarter and told parliamentarians that teachers don't have the necessary skill sets, general education curriculum is insufficient, students don't have timely access to textbooks, and education services are unbalanced. He also confirmed that there are non-existent schools in the country, the extent of which he doesn't know and the international community doesn't know. The international community relies on an education, the Education Management Information System, EMIS, which is an Afghan-run database for education statistics. And we don't have any say in the input of that data. We are trying to help make the data more accurate, we meaning the United States government. But it just goes, the numbers that are thrown out there, 8, 9, 10 million students in school, there's nothing to verify those figures. So we don't know how many kids are in school. There are numbers about student enrollment, but student enrollment consists of students who are present and students who are absent. And you can be absent for 3 years and still be maintained on the education enrollment rolls. Why? Because it makes it easier for the students to get back into the education system if they're, they don't have to go through the administrative process again. But that skews the numbers, doesn't give an honest picture of children in schools, and the United States, other governing agencies have asked the Ministry of Education to not include students who are absent in their enrollment figures. But if we don't know how many kids are in school, we don't know how many textbooks they need, we don't know how many schools are open or closed at any given time, it's very hard to have that open conversation on how much Afghanistan needs to maintain these gains. What kind of infrastructure? How much money did they allocate? If Afghanistan says that they need $10 billion a year in aid, we don't know if that's true or not. We have to really peel these layers back and get a better understanding and have an honest assessment of what's going on in Afghanistan. So I will end there and open it up to questions.
So I know it's probably pretty easy to think that we're the doom and gloomers, right? I won't pretend that this seems like a really robust, happy moment. But I really view this more as a call to action, right? I mean, the United States government is not walking away from Afghanistan. They're not providing the billions that they used to, but they are committed to being there for the years ahead. The money's coming down, and it's, I think, a moment for the United States government to really take stock and look at what needs to be focused on to get it right at this point. We've made great gains, and thank God for those people who risked their lives to make those gains. But now it's time to really steely-eyed look at what's wrong, focus on those things rather than just talk about our successes of the past and go, let's zero in on those challenges and get them right today. And I believe we can. There's no way that you don't get Afghanistan where it is today if it wasn't for the hard work of good people. Again, I think this is just a reset moment for us. As you drop down to the 10,000, maybe even 1,000 U.S. troops, and you drop from $16 billion of U.S. assistance to 4 to 5, we just don't have that margin for error anymore. And I believe that if we, the United States government, really do take these concerns to heart and zero in on those true challenges, then we're going to succeed. So maybe that makes you all a little bit more happy. Is there any questions, though? We can field any questions if anybody has concerns or something they want to focus on a little bit. It's hard to see with the massive light, but there's one back there. Yeah, actually, so the Inspector General, my boss, recently met with the Minister of Education, and I think it's a pragmatic approach that made sense to us, what the Minister of Education is trying to do. First and foremost, he's going to do the best he can to kind of spot check the academic, the data based on what's in the system. Sometimes a paper review actually can clean things out quite a bit. His second thing he wants to do, and USAID can get some credit for this as well, is the Minister of Education wants to do a robust remote monitoring. Right? So you're going to hire someone to go out there and try to figure out, just through kind of random sampling, just go out and see what you have. It's going to be hard to assess every single school, but go out there, kind of get a sampling, and then do some projections after that. Now, the ministry has some really bold plans to try to use biometric information going forward. That probably isn't sustainable in Afghanistan. But I think AIDS through 5-tier monitoring might be the approach to do. First off, do a little geospatial analysis. See if there is a school building there or not. I can only tell you so much. Then, try to get the implementing partners to report back information. Try to get the Ministry's Education to report back information. Try to randomly go out and visit using, NGOs or Afghans themselves. And you'll never do 100% inventory in a conflict zone. That's not possible. But I think trying those different tools to poke and prod on a consistent basis to make someone know that there is someone, whether it's the ministry or the USAID working with the ministry, looking over people's shoulder, I think you get a lot more honesty. I think that's some of the challenge, is to make sure people know that someone is going to be looking. And if you do that, I think you'll get to a better place. You'll never get to 100%. That's not possible. But I think with that kind of mix, maybe you can get to a point where you have a 90% comfort level. And that might be the best you can do in a conflict zone.
Well, the good news is that the Minister of Education is aware of the issue, and part of his 100-day plan is to address this issue. The World Bank is also very interested in this, as is USAID, and they are working with the ministry to try to validate the data within EMIS, the database system, and to make sure it's accurate, and that should help give us a better, more accurate picture. I don't think it'll ever be perfect, but as long as they and we maintain some kind of visibility on this, we're moving in the right direction.
Yeah, I'm right there.
That you're speaking about education in a very general sense. Education and culture in Afghanistan necessarily requires a discussion of gender. So is there a plan, as one of the layers of the education plan, a very gender-centric, because you're talking about a workforce that may not be educated. My assumption is that workforce is mainly male. You're talking about something like a boundary wall, there not being sufficient plumbing. That scares away women or young girls once they reach a certain time. So, is that part of the education plan, or is it still at a very generalized level?
Right now, it's very general terms for gender. I know we're in the middle of an education audit that I believe is looking at this. I don't know to what level, but right now it's mostly in general terms. It's not gender specific, although it is a huge problem. And something else, another variable dealing with gender are insurgent groups in Taliban who physically scare students away, or the news reports of poisonings in schools, which we cannot verify, and that the U.S. government, I don't think, is verifying, although maybe they are, but just not publicly. It is a very sensitive situation. Sorry, I don't have much more information.
Yeah, I can also just speak to that actually in response. I'm Kristen Cordell. I'm the Senior Gender Advisor for USAID's Office of Afghanistan Pakistan Affairs. I'll be talking a little bit in the afternoon, but just to respond, USAID's investment in education has been one of the most gender mainstreamed components of our work from the beginning, and that's had tremendous results. One program that's been specifically significant is the community-based education program, which recognizes that by actually moving schools closer to the communities where these girls are living, you have dramatic increases in enrollment. And in response to that, and I'll speak a little bit to this afternoon, we've actually just recently designed an entire program called Promote, which recognizes that now we have this new, really engaged, educated group of young women who are ready to take part in the labor force and sort of helps them take that next step. So I think your point is a great one, and everything from the infrastructure of our schools to the type of learning to where they're actually based has been shown to have dramatic impact. So I look forward to continuing the conversation on that.
Hi, I have a quick question about energy. You had said that in September gases won't be subsidized anymore. So I was wondering if in the development plan was there any consideration for alternative energy?
Yes, there is. USAID is working with the Afghan government on a solar energy project. I think it can potentially produce about 10 megawatts of power out of their generators.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, it's a scalable solar power project in Kandahar that would allow itself to go up to 10 megawatts. But quite honestly, there's still going to be kind of an energy shortfall because number one, it'll take a little bit of time to do that. Even with the 10 additional megawatts and the additional megawatts coming on board with the Kajaki Dam when it comes on at some point, you're still going to have a shortage of power based on current demand. Particularly if you think about Kajaki, the power coming from Kajaki just doesn't solely go to Kandahar, it goes to other places as well in Helmand province. So there still is an overall net energy problem. The US government is trying to overcome that, not so much through renewable energy, even though there are projects that deal with that. The long-term solution really is to bring power down from the south, to build kind of a unified electrical grid so that you don't have little pockets. In the south you have a pocket, you have a kind of a pocket in Herat, you kind of have a linked thing from the north leading into the Kabul area. If you can have a unified grid, you can get some energy efficiency pulling power out of the north, perhaps even to the larger kind of investment that wants to be done in the region. And that probably is, from a cost standpoint, probably a more effective way to do it, but it's going to take time.
Right, and that's what I was referring to earlier in my presentation. There's a northeast power system and a southeast power system, and there's an effort, a U.S. effort, to connect the two. That should give more overall coverage to the country, specifically for Kandahar. Once the diesel, and again, that's years, decades away from fruition. Until that point, Kandahar is going to need electricity and power, and there's a real conundrum what's going to happen in September. So that's the more acute issue, while the international community works on the larger power programs, transmission lines, substations, and connecting all that.
I think it's probably a good example of something Cigar's been poking at for a long time. The interim solution, the bridging solution is sometimes referred to, was not a bad idea. I mean, putting power into Kabul created economic opportunity, right, which helped in the military campaign, but also just helped with development assistance in the region. The challenge has always been, and we've poked again, and we're not the only ones who've asked these questions, is do you really have a long-term integrated strand to make sure that you just don't kind of drop off the cliff at some point, right? That you actually have uniform amount of power over time so that people, let's say January 2017, don't lose 10 megawatts of power. Because if you do that, again, you're going to weaken people's belief in government and the United States assistance. These are things that don't really make sense. So this is, again, I think a good role of Cigar is that we constantly are asking the embassy and the U.S. military, what is your plan for this? To try to be honest about the fact that the long-term solution will take time, and you've got to plan for that interim, or else what will happen is at the last moment you'll scramble, and you'll probably make bad decisions, right? Like buying more diesel on sustainable fashion.
Right.
Or try to come up with a project that just can't be done in the short term. And again, that's not in our interests in the long run. I think we can field one more question if there's any more.
Hi, Stacy Wiesbach from Washington, D.C., actually. So, two quick questions. One, you mentioned a 100-day plan. Is that an internal plan or is that public information?
I'm sorry, is that an interim plan or?
Is that an internal plan that you guys are working on, or
No,
is that?
Each ministry, President Ghani asked each ministry to produce a 100-day plan. So you have for Ministry of Education, Ministry of Mines, Ministry of Health. Not all of them are on their websites and made public. Some of them are in English, some are not. We are gathering them and going through them. From what I've seen, again, they are steps in the right direction, if not overly ambitious. I don't know how implementable they are, but that doesn't make them to be bad plans. But if you go to the various ministry websites, some are better sites than others, but you can find them there.
My actual second question was, we had mentioned energy and renewables, and my question is simply, if we're looking to build a grid to transport power, isn't that actually counterproductive to creating a sustainable environment for them in the long term?
Well, I mean, the real question is, can they sustain such a massive investment? Do they have the money to do so? Do they have the technical capacity to do so? I mean, these are important questions, and
Yeah, I mean, I think those are, yeah, I don't think we have the simple answer
there
for
is
you
no
there.
real answer.
I
We don't know.
I think we're struggling even just to ensure a sustainable amount of power, let alone the type of power. In the region, people are asking these questions, but it'll take time. I mean, Afghanistan, like many developing countries, the solution isn't a 2-year solution. It's a 5-year, it's a 10-year, it's a 15, it could be a 20-year solution. So I think you're asking the right questions. I think some of the U.S. government's kind of short-term perspective is probably eating away at that kind of hard questioning to maybe answer the questions that you're really driving at. With that, I just really want to thank all of you for being here. I definitely want to thank the University of Massachusetts for letting us come and speak to you all today. I know that we seem like the doom and gloomers, but again, I really encourage you to take these conversations to heart. You know, it's really looking hard at the problem and being honest with ourselves about what we have to address. And if we do that, you know, we can succeed. We can help the Afghan government succeed. The new national unity government is struggling mightily, but making, I think, some progress on some of these challenges. And the U.S. assistance isn't going away. I think there's a narrative in the media that thinks that, you know, once the U.S. troops go away, that's the end of the U.S. investment in Afghanistan, and that's just not true. There will be in the tunes of $4 to $5 billion of assistance going forward, even if you get to 1,000 U.S. soldier footprint going forward, and that money is being committed for quite some time. So there's still a lot of good that can be done. The question is making sure that we focus on the problems honestly, tackling them honestly, and I believe that the U.S. government, with smart people like you in this room helping us focus our energies, will succeed. So thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And feel free to bug us if you like.